This is a podcast from the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge.
I'm Lucilla Burn. I'm Keeper of Antiquities at the Fitzwilliam Museum. I'm technically in charge of this refurbishment for everything from raising the money for it to putting the objects in the cases, but of course I had a large team of people working with me. The project took about 2 years, but we had been fundraising for about a year before then. The galleries were last refurbished in a major way in 1963, so that's getting on really nearly 50 years, and they were really starting to show their age. There was also a big problem that people used to rush straight through to Egypt, which has always had much more popular appeal than Greece and Rome, and so the room was rather a corridor. It looked quite nice in terms of the architecture, but people used to rush straight on through the gallery and not really look to left or right, so we were encouraging people to circulate around the edges and spend a bit longer in the gallery than they did before. This is one of the top 3 collections of Greek and Roman antiquities in the country, along with London, of course, British Museum and the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. We have a great variety of objects, everything from the Aegean Bronze Age from about 3000 BC up to the later Roman period. The latest object in the gallery is probably about AD 400. And within that range we have lots of different materials, from bronze to pottery to ivory, gold and silver, and everything from a colossal scale statue from Eleusis of the Roman period down to really tiny miniature works.
I'm Mary Beard and I'm Professor of Classics in the University in Cambridge, and I was one of the team of academics working on this collaborative project with the museum professionals in the Fitzwilliam. So it was a joint enterprise. It was a rather imaginatively funded scheme by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which was intended to bring together academics with people working on museums in thinking about all kinds of things. And it's very exciting in the ancient world because the study of Greek and Roman art has been really going places recently in universities. We've been thinking much more interestingly about, say, what the images on Greek pots actually mean, not just what they are, but what on earth they meant. And it's great fun then to be able to put some of that rather library-based research together with actually hands-on museum display. And the academics certainly learnt a very great deal about what you can and can't do in a museum. We'd go in and say, oh, it'd be really nice to have that sculpture right in the middle there. And then we'd be very firmly told that the floor wouldn't support something that weight. So I feel I'm pretty chastened by having to get rid of some of my naivety about how easy it is to do museum display. Museum display is terribly difficult. We thought for ages about some things we would put on the labels or what we wouldn't put on the labels. So it's been a learning experience all round, but I think the result is really exciting. Actually, it's a completely different way of displaying the collection from what we had before. I think it looks really good, but I think it's actually also really answering the sort of issues that people have about these things. I mean, I think most visitors don't want to be simply told what something is, even if we don't really know. They want to really think hard about the questions that sometimes puzzle people who've worked on them for 40 years of what this thing is, what was it for, when was it used, how was it used, those kind of things.
One object that we put out that wasn't on display before is a piece of stone that at first looks perhaps slightly unprepossessing. It's a fairly roughly shaped piece of dark blackish limestone, and if you look closely at it, it is carved with an interesting graffito which shows a flying fish or dolphin, and beside this someone has scratched their name and the word drew, so somebody drew this. And I think that's rather nice. It's a sort of dates to about 550 BC, and the rock itself is shaped perhaps like the tail of a dolphin or a fish of some sort, a diving fish. And this comes from the north coast of Crete, and there are quite a lot of graffiti like that found there, and they were probably inspired by dolphins and porpoises that people saw in the sea in the Mediterranean just off the coast there. In the centre of the room we have put a selection of funerary sculpture, both Greek and Roman, and this includes 2 very large Roman sarcophagi or carved marble coffins. We've got them at right angles to the window, partly because this really emphasises the beauty of their relief carving. Before, they were shown parallel to the window, and actually moving them into place on their new bunk bed arrangement was a very major logistical and practical undertaking. The bigger of the two weighs 2.4 metric tons. We didn't actually know the weight until we got a firm of stone movers in to move it, and they kindly weighed it for us. They do look very spectacular. They're lit up very beautifully, and you can really see the detail on them. We've got a range of funerary monuments, actually. Those would have been provided for very wealthy Romans, and then we also have some more modest monuments, including one which actually comes from Britain, belonged to a Greek. It's a Greek inscription from Britain, from Brough under Stainmore in Cumbria, and it's the tombstone of a young man called Hermes, who was presumably something to do with the Roman army in Britain, and he must have died while on active service here. So that's in the local red sandstone of Cumbria. So we have a big range of funerary monuments there.
It's been great fun getting to know the collection in its the history of some of these objects. And one of the things that we've been very keen to stress is that the history of ancient objects doesn't stop when they come out of the ground or when someone discovers them in parts of the mountains of rural Crete or whatever. The history goes on through their conservation, through their being sold, their being collected by different people, put together in a different way, studied differently, put on display in a museum, and so on. And there are all kinds of curious, absolutely intriguing stories about some of these. I mean, I think my absolutely favourite one is a Greek pot, a Greek drinking cup that you can see nicely on display in the museum, which has a naked man on it. And the naked man has, well, his genitals look rather different from the rest of him. It's slightly different colour, and you perhaps wouldn't think anything of it. You might not even notice it. It wasn't until our conservators explained to me why that I realised what a strange story it was. And in fact, it was a gift to the museum by two late 19th, 20th century guys, or the aesthetic pair, and they'd acquired this pot and had obviously been a bit disappointed that the naked man didn't appear to have any genitals, and so actually had the genitals painted in, or rather they painted them in themselves. And to start with, this looked wonderful, no doubt, and you wouldn't have been able to tell the difference, but funny things that happen to pots over time, and different materials, even slightly different materials, turn significantly different colours. And what's happened here is the beautiful painted in genitals, as the decades have passed, have faded to be a rather different colour from what these guys, Mr. Ricketts and Mr. Shannon, would ever have hoped. One nice thing is to see people's attempts to improve the things, to conserve them, but then those too become part of the history of the object.
As well as introducing the Greek and Roman world in general, we've tried to emphasise a number of themes, including those of collectors. We've asked, how did these objects come to Cambridge? Partly, where were they found? And we're lucky to have quite a few objects from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. One is one of the stars of our show, which is a large bust of Hadrian's lover, Antinous. He drowned in the Nile. Did he drown, or was he drowned? Nobody quite knows. In AD 130, and there are a number of statues of him which were made by Hadrian after his death. We have two architectural pieces, lovely column capitals, also from Hadrian's villa, and on loan to us at the moment, a very interesting relief with mythological scenes in an unusual type of black marble. Now, both the black marble relief and the Antinous bust were in the collection of the first Marquis of Lansdowne, and they were discovered at Hadrian's villa in 1769. The Antinous then went through various collections and ended up being given to the museum by Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon in 1937. The black marble relief is still in the collection of the current Marquis of Lansdowne. We're very lucky that we have that here on loan at the moment. So we've been able to make a sort of link between these types of object and explain where they're from. We've got other collectors represented in different parts of the gallery as well, so that is one of the questions we're trying to put some answers to. How did these objects get here? We've also been trying to say, why do these objects look the way they do? We've put conservation quite in the foreground in this display. For example, some of the Greek pots, people often say, why is it broken like this? And we've tried to explain that a lot of them were broken before they came to the museum, and they've been restored in various different ways. And we're trying to engage the public in thinking about how they like to see their pots restored. Do they like them restored so you can't tell they were ever broken, or do they prefer to see them and understand that they were broken? And we've tried to show there are different styles, and some have one advantage and some another.
I also got a very great soft spot for a rather, at first sight, dull bit of ancient sculpture, a bit of relief sculpture with a male figure on it. Because it's got such an extraordinary history, it was collected by a man who was the contemporary of Lord Elgin, a guy called Edward Daniel Clarke, who was a Cambridge professor. And he'd seen what Lord Elgin was doing, or Lord Elgin's men were doing on the Acropolis in Athens when they were removing the Parthenon sculptures, and said he was shocked. On the other hand, Edward Daniel Clarke also was quite keen on getting a bit of the Parthenon for himself. And he tells us that he wouldn't do anything like what Elgin did. So he actually went to the garrison commander in Athens, because the Parthenon at that period was actually in the middle of an Ottoman military base. Clarke went to the garrison commander and bought a piece of the Parthenon from him, one that didn't have to be removed from the building, but had just fallen off. And he's terribly pleased with himself. And he writes about how this is the only piece of the Parthenon to come to England that was acquired honestly and honourably and legally and ethically. And he thinks it's a metope, one of the sculptured panels from around the top of the Parthenon. And indeed, it does look a bit like this. But what we know now, and what Clarke didn't know, is it didn't come from the Parthenon at all. It probably came from some Roman building, perhaps a bit of theatrical decoration, we really don't know. But hundreds and hundreds of years later than the Parthenon. So Clarke was so kind of self-satisfied with getting this piece of Phidian artistry in a way that was not like Elgin had done, but in fact he hadn't got anything like what he thought he had. It wasn't done by the great sculptor Phidias at all, and it was probably done about 600 years later. So it's a funny story, because, in some ways, you catch some of these collectors out hundreds of years later.
While we were dismantling the gallery, we came across a time capsule that had been put there in 1963. The people working on the gallery had all engraved their names in some wet cement into which they were setting an inscription. I have to say it took a long time and cost a lot of money to hack the inscription out of this cement, which we've done, and we've displayed it, we think, more sympathetically. But along with the names, there was a polythene bag that contained 2 copies of the Cambridge News from 1963 and some new pennies. One of the people who actually put the time capsule there has recently visited the museum, Frank Rook. He's now 90, and he was delighted to see it again and to reminisce about how he'd put it there. We're going to put our own time capsule in. We just haven't quite got round to it, but we shall be putting in our own copy of the Cambridge News, I'm sure, and a few other relevant items. We're really thrilled with the way the gallery looks. We think everything looks very sort of sparkling and fresh and interesting, and it's wonderful seeing people in here, visitors enjoying it, and we hope everyone who comes will enjoy it and come back.